Fantastic. All right, let's get going. Um, so uh, today I'm going to give this talk about pensions and the dream of a well-earned rest. I'm going to offer various responses to a potential liberal worry about pensions. And this is the first time I've given this paper. So I'm really looking forward to getting some feedback on it. Okay, so Germany, here's Otto von Bismarck colorized for your pleasure. Germany was the first state to introduce a public pension in 1889. So as a universal entitlement for all workers. And it was kind of pushed through by Bismarck, who was very resolute about instituting the pension. In the Reichstag, he famously shouted, "Call it socialism or whatever you will, I don't care." Socialism was almost a slur at the time, so this was he went to the wall for this initiative. Now, the age at which German workers could access the new pension benefit in 1889 was 70. But Bismarck, as you can probably tell from this photo, was a little older than that. He was 74. And he actually supplies an illustration then of an interesting fact about the old age pension scheme, which is that many of the people who stand to benefit from pensions arguably don't need them. So unlike other components of modern social insurance programs, old age pensions don't aim to mitigate any specific burden. They're not targeted at disease, disability, or poverty. Age itself isn't a harm, or we'll consider whether it is today, but let's just take it as given for the moment that age itself isn't a harm, yet age is the thing to which the benefit responds. And the pension doesn't merely enable people to cease working, it incentivizes them to do so. The economic literature is really clear about this, that incentives, the incentive power of pensions is pretty strong. That means that pensions are work discouraging, and I think that's very interesting. Now, most modern states with defined benefit pension schemes are liberal states, but a spending program that fails to pursue any clearly defined end of welfare or rights and that permanently discourages one sector of the population from working arguably violates liberal neutrality. So the position that the liberal state should not promote any particular vision of the good life, but rather provide a neutral framework in which citizens should pursue their own conception of it. State-sponsored pensions appear to violate this principle by supporting retirement, which is a culturally contingent practice. It's a relatively novel idea. In the 1880s, 68% or something of Americans were working well into their 70s. So it's relatively recent that we've come by the expectation that we should finish working. So in this paper, I ask, on what grounds, if any, can a liberal state institute a policy like the public pension with the aim of permanently discouraging the elderly from work? Could spurring retirement on the basis of age ever be a legitimate liberal goal, given commitments to liberal neutrality? And I consider 5 potential justifications for pensions that treat work discouragement as an appealing feature rather than a costly bug of pension adoption. So I'll begin by taking up a suggestion that's familiar from the 19th and early 20th century debates about pensions, which is that society can maximize economic productivity by bookending work lives with age limits. So this justifies state support for pensions in kind of broadly utilitarian terms, the ends of maximizing productivity. Then I'll move to consider whether offering an age-based retirement option is what a decent society does in recognition of a lifetime economic contribution. So this is a kind of argument from desert, not as part of the vision for the good life, but as kind of an apt form of social compensation for a life's labor. Then I ask whether old age is in fact a burden. Is old age something that could be construed as a harm, and can support to retire be justified in welfarist terms as alleviating something that is in fact analogous to disability or illness? Then I consider whether retirement is an apt means of securing the conditions for distinctive goods that only the elderly can afford society if given sufficient time in which to do so. So these are forms of knowledge and value transmission that are enabled by their position in the great chain of generations, and I'll be referencing the work of Samuel Scheffler here. Then I'll move finally to draw threads from each of the preceding arguments. So each of these arguments will have some interesting insights, but we'll find them deficient in certain ways. So then the final move, I'll draw threads from them and reframe the pension as a response to a kind of coordination problem that only the state is well placed to solve. And this relies on a conjecture about the common will. And it relies on an argument that nearly everybody, every reasonable body, will anticipate wanting to retire. And so the state by instituting a pension, realizes rather than imposes a value by making the option available. Okay, so that's the kind of broad structure. So let's start with this consideration of maximizing productivity. Now, probably none of you were alive in 1905, but if you were, you might have heard about this speech by William Osler. William Osler was the most famous physician of his day. He was a really famous doctor who worked at Johns Hopkins University, and everything he did kind of got widely reported in the presses because he was such a kind of eminent figure. And when he decided to leave his position at Johns Hopkins, when he was in his 50s, he decided he wanted to kind of take a step back. He gave an address, a kind of valedictory address, in which he playfully examined the professional lifespan of the worker and asserted the basic inutility of workers over 60 years old. Now, because he was the most famous physician of his day, the speech was widely reported in the presses. It went viral. And it's important to note that although the speech, although Osler did in fact support a retirement age and social institutions that supported the existence of a retirement age, the speech was given in a very satirical voice. So it referenced an Anthony Trollope novel where Trollope talks about chloroforming the old, until they peacefully die. So it wasn't intended to be kind of like the serious expression of this social program, but the news media read it as exactly that, as they want to do. So something rather strange and uncomfortable happened after he gave this speech. First, there was a moral panic. So here are some headlines, representative sample of headlines from the day. Lethal chamber for the age, sexagenarian panic, says the New York Daily News. Fixes limit of man's usefulness at 40. Osler asserts belief that value to the world ends then, writes the New York Times. So there's this moral panic. Then the claim finds some public defenders. So there's this great opinion piece in the Ottawa Daily News where someone argues that actually, quite seriously, have you encountered anyone over 40? They are kind of deficient in reasoning. Things do fall apart. Do we really want them in the workforce? So Osler's claims subsequently found public defenders, and they actually ended up being kind of integrated into an emerging debate about the social place of old age and old workers. And the idea that workers had something like a use-by date took a firm hold in popular discourse. Now, if it were true that people suffered a predictable and precipitous decline in productivity in old age, and if one of the liberal states' legitimate aims was to maximize economic productivity, then that might supply reason to adopt policies that incentivize the old to leave work. So imagine for a moment with the author of a tremendously popular Depression-era plan called the Townsend Plan, which advocated pensions as a means to job redistribution from the old to the young, that we live in a world in which older workers are occupying scarce jobs that would otherwise be available to out-of-work younger workers. And say that we grant, for argument's sake, that the average 65-year-old will be less productive in aggregate terms at the same job as the average 35-year-old. Suppose we further grant that removing the 65-year-old would free up a position for the 35-year-old and increase total economic output. Now, if we grant all of this, then we might start to see old age pensions as job redistributing devices, an elegant solution to the problem of youth unemployment and a spur to greater economic productivity. Now, it's important to note that the underlying assumptions of the Townsend Plan are highly unreliable. It commits, for example, what economists call the lump of labor fallacy. It assumes that there is something like a fixed amount of work to be done and that that work can be neatly redistributed. In fact, there's little evidence of an association between the rate of youth employment and that of older workers. It's worth noting that contemporary studies also call into question the association that Osler so confidently asserted between advancing age and falling productivity. Although the belief that older workers are less productive is a very widespread one, and it serves to influence both hiring and retiring decisions in economic studies, recent literature in economics challenges the validity of the belief that older workers actually do suffer declining productivity. And this is kind of industry specific, but there are cases in which they actually end up being more productive, or if you add an older worker to a team, the team ends up being more productive, and we can kind of draw conclusions about why that might be the case. But the association that Osler draws looks pretty shaky on the basis of contemporary data. But This is all empirical stuff. More importantly, for our argumentative purposes, the Townsend approach clearly violates liberal neutrality. So in hearing about this kind of plan, the liberal might simply respond that the utility or otherwise of labourers is properly something for the market to decide. They might even move to scold a little. They might say something like, look, a state that arrogates powers to itself to assess workers as less or more productive and to engage in public policy aimed at redistributing their jobs is engaged in a kind of form of coercion. Such a state takes an impermissibly instrumental stance to its citizens and their livelihoods by ranking them according to productive worth and distributing social benefits accordingly. All of this should be off the table. But maybe that's a little bit too quick. So note that modern societies do in fact have, right, modern liberal societies do in fact have a suite of coercive social policies that limit the availability of labour based on considerations of age and of maximising human capital. So child labour and education laws aim at controlling the age at which workers first enter the workforce. They're widely accepted as consistent with the goals of liberal society. Laws that incentivise school attendance, that punish truancy, that ban child labour, have all served to bring about a world in which the working lives of American adults start much later than they might have otherwise. These laws are defended in a variety of ways, but one familiar economic argument holds that they are necessary to promote the human capital of children, that allowing children to enter the workforce too young reduces their lifetime earnings and productivity, and that's something that in aggregate impacts the economic well-being of society taken as a whole. I've got this great ad here, which says, 2 million child workers under 16 years today, we want them to be normal men and women. So there's a great assumption built in there about a loss of human capital. So we might reason by analogy from the apparent permissibility of these coercive policies, their economic justification, to the permissibility of the relatively gentle strategy of the old age pension, which by comparison merely offers people an option on leaving the workforce. It doesn't restrain them from participating or not participating in it. So if we conceive that as a means to promote economic productivity and youth employment, then maybe it starts looking more palatable. But the analogy between the case of child workers and older workers quickly falls apart because there are no comparable sets of reasons that apply in later life to these reasons. Child labour laws invest in future capital, but pensions conceived as work-discouraging policies subtract from existing human capital. So one enhances human capital, the other subtracts from it. We don't maximise the human capital of older workers by removing them from the workforce. We simply remove people who might otherwise contribute to production on the tenuous kind of promise that doing so might somehow spur an employment effect. And this leads to a further observation, which is that child labour laws protect the people whose activities they limit. So if we think about these as kind of paternalistic provisions, there might be some sort of justification available. But pensions as work displacement policies don't primarily function to protect the interests of the people whose activities they limit. So it's much harder to mount a liberal defense when no benefit or a limited relative benefit is offered to the person that the state aims to directly interfere with. There are also principled considerations of autonomy that favour child labour laws and that by extension disfavour policies that aim to limit the careers of adults. So children are often viewed as having impaired autonomy. They need to be protected. They need to be raised in certain ways that realise their full range of agency later in life. And child labour laws are often justified in these terms as autonomy protecting. But a framework that aims to protect the future autonomy of children should arguably also be committed to respecting the autonomy of adults. And if older adults wish to remain in the workforce, then why should they be deterred? So to just conclude this section, we've weighed the liberal justification of an idea that's drawn from the early debates about pensions and retirement age, that pensions can be justified as a means to promote aggregate economic productivity. And we've seen that this economic gambit is shaky, that productivity doesn't necessarily decline with age, and that even if it did, it's not clear that removing older workers from the workforce will spur aggregate productivity or have a positive employment effect for younger workers. But even granting some dubious economic assumptions, we found that the liberal state shouldn't implement pensions on the grounds of productivity. So reasoning by analogy to the permissibility of child labour laws only served to evoke a suite of liberal considerations that actually favour limiting access to work at one end of life and that may even disfavour state intervention at the other. So let's see if we can find more fertile terrain. So moving on to the consideration of desert. Another way that retirement was characterized in the early debates about pensions was in terms of a kind of entitlement that we were due as a matter of our just deserts, as workers who've committed a certain amount of social contribution to society, we were then due an option on a peaceful rest. So the preamble to the New Zealand Pension Act of 1898 states, "It is equitable that deserving persons who during the prime of life have helped to bear the public burdens of the colony by the payment of taxes and to open up its resources by their labour and skill, should receive from the colony a pension in their old age." Laws like this, which explicitly invoke these kind of desert-based equitable notions, justify old age pensions as a matter of desert. Workers contribute in myriad ways to society, and as such, they were owed a means of living without working in old age. Now, the argument from desert holds that the long-term worker is due a distinct form of compensation from the state. This might seem surprising since the worker has already been paid a wage for their labour. But as the New Zealand preamble suggests, a worker's taxes and productive activity generate broader kind of social contributions or social benefits for which they don't directly receive compensation. These are the positive externalities of a life of labour. The worker does in fact benefit from the social services that their contributions help to sustain. So they benefit from roads, they benefit from police, they benefit from social services, but these goods are non-excludable. So even lifelong non-workers can enjoy them as well. So you might think, on that basis, that some further compensation is due to the worker from a grateful society for assuming personal costs and generating social benefits. Early proponents of pensions held that the fitting form for this compensation to take was the promise of liberation from work. At a certain point, society should step in and offer the steady worker the opportunity to retire. Now, you're probably thinking, if you're a philosopher, but hang on, desert-based benefits are subject to proportionality constraints. So bigger contributions warrant bigger rewards. And one limitation of this kind of general argument from desert is that defined benefit pensions, like the Social Security system instituted in the US, are not proportionate to workers' actual social contributions. Inputs like age and work history don't map onto the positive externalities that things like the preamble invoked. So things like tax contribution and the size of social contribution, these vary widely among individuals. And it's not always net positive. So one response could be that the pension simply uses labour market participation as a practical proxy for net social contribution, accepting some injustice at the margins. That might be a nice pragmatic thing to say. But the pension's lack of proportionality could also be explained by a distinct consideration that's also at play in some of this thinking. And that consideration is the consideration of the dignity of workers. So historical desert-based entitlement arguments often invoke dignity alongside desert. And I think that's really interesting. A fixed entitlement paid out in response to a universal property like age recognizes workers as effective equals. What matters is that they contributed. The defined character of the defined benefit scheme signals that it is an honor, not a form of charity. It's insensitive to the recipient's economic status. There are important distinctions between benefits that express social recognition, as we heard in Josh's talk, and those that connote assistance. One affirms the recipient's status as a contributor, the other positions them as a dependent. Early pension advocates often thought it degrading for a lifelong worker to claim poverty relief. They didn't want to put workers in the position of having to claim poverty. Instead of requiring the needy older worker to accept help that was also available to those who never contributed, so to lifelong non-workers, the pension was supposed to anticipate the needs of workers and recognize their contribution through a universal entitlement. This was dignity supporting. Indexing to age was elegant. It defined and honoured a whole life's work without implicating infirmity or destitution, and it protected workers from having to ask for help. Desert tells us that the worker is owed something. Dignity, then, on this account, conditions how it should be delivered. So a resulting case for a defined benefit pension is actually a hybrid one. It rests on two distinct values, and each of these contribute an element of the calculus. But it remains to note that, however appealing, the account developed here still fails to answer a key question, which is why should the recognition of the worker's lifelong contribution, why should recognition of their dignity and desert take the form of liberation from work? So why the pension? We may think, yeah, someone who is a net social contributor, who contributes all these positive externalities, who puts themselves in the position of labour, is due something extra. But why should that something extra be support to retire? Why not simply pay a lump sum? Why not give them a participation trophy? Why not give them free meals in the Praedoneum? Why this particular benefit? The implicit suggestion of early pension proponents seems to be that work is itself a grave burden, making relief from it a natural and fitting form of recognition. Now, that might have been true, but to adopt that assumption today is arguably to violate something like liberal neutrality. Perhaps in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, working conditions were so extreme that it was reasonable to characterize work as generically burdensome. But we live in an era of employment protections and automation in which the average job in a developed country carries little risk of death or disability. We no longer think of work as something that uses a person up, but the language of using people up is kind of diffuse in the early accounts of the justification of pensions. Lee Welling Squires talks about using a person up only to leave the remnant floating on society at large as a derelict at sea. Which is a really moving kind of phrase, but it doesn't feel necessarily apt to the conditions of labor in the modern US. So perhaps we don't enjoy the same license today to characterize work as generically burdensome. Perhaps it's wrong for the state to assess that working is generally unpleasant and harmful to its citizens. And so while we might maintain some sensitivity to the considerations of desert and dignity that moved our forebears, it doesn't obviously follow today that worker contributors are aptly due social recognition in the form of pensions. Okay, so then this argument maybe doesn't get us where we want to go. But let's think about old age again. So we concluded the last set of considerations by observing that a state which characterized all work as generically burdensome would violate liberal neutrality. But if old age pensions actually serve to alleviate something that was nearly universally experienced as a burden, something the ordinary citizen would recognize as such, then the liberal state might yet be entitled to institute one on grounds of welfare. And here the burden I'm thinking about isn't work itself, but rather the burden of old age. So it's widely accepted that providing special support to the sick, the disabled, those lacking sufficiency, none of that violates liberal neutrality. So here's another idea. Perhaps old age is itself a burden or form of deprivation, and the pension is a fitting response to that fact. Now, I can think of at least 3 ways to characterize age as deprivation, or as I get older, they keep kind of springing up. But the first is obvious, right, and it's present in all of the early thinking about pensions, and that is age's association with ill health. The second way we might think about characterizing old age in terms of deprivation is to note the relative scarcity of life years experienced by older adults. And the third is this really nice concept that Samuel Scheffler refers to as normative deprivation. I'll get there in a second. Okay, so suppose that reaching a certain age, so let's start with ill health, reliably brings a form of physical infirmity, and that undergoing infirmity alongside the rigors of work presents a person with genuine harm. Should we not then seek to liberate the aged from the workforce? Now, that sounds fine, but if we think about analogies, then we'll immediately notice that as a general rule, the liberal state doesn't seek to prompt disabled workers to leave the workforce because the conjunction of their disability and work makes work onerous for them. Recognizing the role of work as a valuable social functioning, the state rather often intends to or tries to improve health provision or facilitate forms of workplace accessibility. So if aged workers are more likely to suffer infirmity, then we might think that what the state should do, by analogy to the case of people who experience lifelong disabilities, is secure accommodations that preserve the option of people who are becoming infirm to continue to pursue paid employment, this valuable social functioning. We shouldn't aim to remove them from it, we should aim to facilitate their participation in it. You might think, no, but the comparison to disability breaks down in a morally revealing way. And there are various ways that we could go with this, but one that I think is kind of interesting is if we imagine, so philosopher, let's do a thought experiment, imagine a drug that prevents all diseases of aging, okay? So we no longer experience arthritis, we no longer experience fatigue, we no longer experience cataracts, and natural lifespans remain unchanged. So we can still expect to live our, God-given a lot of 77 years or whatever it is, but we won't decline towards that goal. Now, having such a drug would have obvious welfarist benefits, But its availability doesn't seem to kill the appeal of the idea of retirement. And it doesn't also seem to me to fatally undermine the case for a public pension. So even if we could facilitate people to remain in the workforce in perfect health, right up until the moment of their death, it somehow doesn't seem to follow that we should do so. And so that to me says that there's something about the ill health line that isn't getting to kind of all of the things that worry us about age when we think about age in terms of deprivation. It suggests that the case for the pension can't rest on infirmity alone, that there's maybe some remainder here that we want to think about. Maybe that remainder, maybe that lingering sense that we have that a person who is, reaching the end of their natural lifespan is facing a form of deprivation. Maybe that remainder is accounted for by the fact that old age often connotes a scarcity of life years. So maybe if we move from ill health and we think about scarcity of years, that's where we'll capture, our intuitions again. Philosophers sometimes characterize the badness of death in terms of the deprivation of future goods. Now, the pension doesn't increase life years, but if it allowed an older person to accrue more goods in what time remained, then that might count in its favor. That might attenuate the harm of the scarcity of life years. I'm not sure about this thought, but it connects in an interesting way to the third and what I think might be the most promising of these three roots, which is Scheffler's notion of normative deprivation. So in Scheffler's account, the older those with a preponderance of friendships that are ended by death. This is a really sad idea. But how do you know that you're old? According to Samuel Scheffler, more of your friends have died than not. So someone who experiences the preponderance of what he calls archived relationships, which is a really weird euphemism for having people that you love die. But imagine yourself in this position. Someone in that position experiences a deprivation of value. Meaningful relationships are the basis of a lot of the value that we experience in our lives. They're, integrated with our projects. So we undergo a kind of normative impoverishment. And confronted with this experience of normative impoverishment, people face a conundrum, right? What should I do with the time that I have left? How can I secure a certain amount of meaning in my life? One thing that Scheffler suggests that people can do is they can try and dwell among their memories. But he points out that that's ultimately kind of unsatisfactory, that memories don't offer that much solace for the loss of meaningful relationships, or they can work to forge new bonds and projects. But working to forge new bonds and projects is really costly. Doing so freely is difficult when much of one's conscious time is spent at work, especially under a looming scarcity of life years. So you might think like, well, okay, if the old characteristically suffer this problem of normative deprivation, if they also have this problem of a scarcity of life years, then the solution is to make more free time available to them so that they can attend to filling their lives with meaning in what time they have left. Now, why should the state have a role here? Two responses suggest themselves. So first of all, we might say, look, human beings, because you might think like, well, okay, people know about these phenomena, why don't they plan for them? But you might think, well, first of all, human beings are time biased. So human beings prefer immediate rewards, they delay costs, they're poor at anticipating the needs of their future selves. They're also especially averse to imagining themselves as old, which is a kind of interesting finding from some of the psychological literature. Since time bias is a shared predicament, it might seem reasonable for the state to attend to it as a kind of feature of the human condition. And in the case of friendship in particular, we might think there are special difficulties in planning for one's normative needs in old age. So we can't rely on the individual to do this. It might even be at odds with friendship to plan for one's normative needs in old age. Few people spend their youth anticipating the deaths of their friends or preparing to replace them. To be fully present to a friend, we arguably must not think, when I'm 80 and you're dead, I'll need to find someone else. This is a real problem of planning, and it's a deep one. And second, and this maybe addresses the liberal skeptic more directly, some of the goods at stake in having engaged seniors with rich social lives are public goods, whose supply we should arguably wish to ensure. So let's move, because this is all very sad, let's move to something positive. And to the idea that, maybe by liberating the aged to the state of free time in retirement, we secure certain public goods that we all benefit from. Because the last set of considerations were kind of a bummer. The old are subjected to a predictable condition of normative deprivation. The means of overcoming it weren't clear, but we thought it might plausibly involve leaving work to tend to their meaningful social bonds. Then again, leaving work could also involve social losses. Now, a neutral state that takes normative deprivation seriously but respects individual autonomy might determine that the best policy would be to support positive freedoms of the old as robustly as possible, that being the case, right? So the consideration that maybe being at work is better for your condition of normative poverty, maybe leaving work is better for your condition of normative poverty, we don't know, it's going to be individual specific. Maybe then the state that's concerned about remediating normative deprivation will think, okay, we need to support positive freedom. So we need to secure workplace accommodations, but we also need to make a pension available so that both work and retirement are live options for all aged workers. This doesn't go so far as the state intending that people leave work, but it involves a degree of comfort with the pension's work discouraging character. Now, benefiting the elderly might open up another species of justification. The goods that the pension aims at on this kind of view are goods of social connection, implicating other people beyond its discrete targets. Some relationships that are enabled will be intergenerational ones that, in addition to ameliorating normative deprivation, ground goods that redound to the common weal. These intergenerational goods can take a variety of forms. There are familial goods, like knowing your grandparents. There are epistemic benefits. Older people often have living memory of historical events and social technologies that risk becoming lost. That can be of social value. But of course, it's contingent whether a particular older person stands in the grandparent relation or whether a particular older person has the ability to offer younger people epistemic benefits. Some people will have no interest in relaying the past. Some will have so thoroughly adapted to the present values that they can't faithfully describe past ones. Even the epistemically reliable older person who's inclined to share their wealth of knowledge may find themselves made redundant by better methods of history keeping. So I recently read an article about this new AI agent called Talkie, which maybe you guys have heard of as well, which is trained only on literature that's pre-1931. And so it like perfectly inhabits the kind of the lingo, the cultural reference of, an American living in Chicago in 1931. And you might think like, look, talking to Talkie is always going to be better in terms of these epistemic benefits than talking to an old person who's suffered all the depredations of time and, it's kind of become in some ways enmeshed in the present. And so, they've been marinating in successive systems of value and so forth. But then you might respond, look, an AI agent that's trained on historical tests isn't a human ancestor. Maybe there's something specifically valuable about having these kinds of relationships to human beings. For a younger person, a relationship with an older one, especially a meaningful personal relationship, can help them to feel grounded in the great chain of human generations, and that's something that any of us can experience when we relate to older people. Intergenerational encounters can supply an opportunity for self-situating historical sense-making that can arguably redound to a more meaningful life. And this needn't strain liberal neutrality, perhaps, because intergenerational situatedness might be the sort of good that any human being is likely to value regardless of their particular conception of the good life. Maybe not. Life years are scarce in old age, and so too are opportunities for younger people to access the experiences and insights of specific older people. We've already argued that the pension allows older people who are inclined to, remediate their condition of normative poverty or to seek out the young, the time, the freedom, and the means to do so. It's work discouraging, but we know that it will reliably increase the free time of at least some older citizens. Whether they use that time to provide goods that only they can unlock is ultimately up to them, but at least a basic condition on those goods has been secured. So the argument here is a kind of sketch. It may not supply reasons weighty enough to justify the pension on their own. Old age pensions, after all, represent one of the largest expenditure items on the budgets of OECD countries. The pension may not be the only or even best means to the intergenerational goods that we've kind of considered. But what this kind of argument might do is offer permissibly liberal reasons for adopting the pension as a work discouraging policy, reasons that aren't emphasized in the original cases for pensions, and they're the reasons that are sorely needed, given that many of the original motivations, like the assumption that work is generically burdensome, have arguably expired. But all of that's a bit thin, I think. So let's move to our final species of justification. And so here what I want to do is draw insights from each of the earlier attempts. We conceive the option of retirement as something that the state should support, because doing so realizes the will of the people and it secures something like a Rawlsian primary good. And we conceive the pension as an apt means that can solve a distinctive coordination problem. So begin from the thought that very nearly everybody has good reason to anticipate wanting to retire someday. We've noted that the association between old age and infirmity isn't necessarily empirically justified today, but we do know that we're all finite beings. And each of us knows that given time, the association between old age and infirmity will ultimately hold true. Each of us knows that if we live long enough, old age will entail physical decline, and we can rationally anticipate that at some point, we will simply want to stop working. Even people who genuinely love their work and presently intend to work until death are likely to acknowledge that health may yet present circumstances under which their preferences change. They too may wish for an option on retirement, even if they desperately hope never to have to exercise it. Other common considerations might figure in this kind of thinking as well. So, although we've said that it would be wrong for the state to characterize work as generically burdensome, it is true that many people today do view work as burdensome, as an unpleasant but socially obligatory ordeal. And if we number among those people, it's perfectly reasonable to anticipate that one day we will simply have had enough. Other people have lifelong projects who will, as the sands of time slip through their fingers, grow to regard their dwindling leisure as ever more precious. So these are the people who are particularly afflicted by the sense of normative poverty. So we're maybe we'd arrive at a kind of overlapping consensus. All of this is to say that each of us plausibly has at least one good reason to believe that if we live and work long enough, we will want to retire. The thought of working to death without ever having the option to stop is a horrific one once we weigh all of the reasons that we have to anticipate that future desire. The rational consensus over the value of having an option on retirement could figure in a liberal argument for pensions in more than one way. So the option on retirement could reasonably be characterized as a Rawlsian primary good, something that any rational person wants, whatever else they have, because it secures freedom from the threat of being required to work until death, whatever one's circumstances, something even the workaholic must acknowledge that they may one day need. Or we could invoke a democratic justification. By securing a universal option on retirement, the state isn't promoting retirement as a good per se. It is securing the circumstances under which a nearly universally anticipated preference can be satisfied. When the will of the people coalesces thus around a single goal, it can be a legitimate role of the liberal democratic state to make it available. Doing so does not violate neutrality, it would realize the common will. You might still think, no, but hang on. Like, if we all anticipate wanting to retire, then why should we not all just save individually toward that end? But such a response, I think, ignores the greater advantage of the public pension, which allows us to anticipate on drawing on a much greater amount than we could individually save through the efficiency gains of risk pooling. So it's much more efficient to save together and thereby increase our collective saving power. We might also recall the time bias problem that I mentioned earlier. Individuals systematically undersave for retirement due to present bias, meaning a private savings solution will fail even for people who intend to save, and that's been borne out in the economic literature. The state that intervenes to create the pool solves the coordination problem and brings about, at least ex ante, a Pareto improvement. Some of us will never benefit for our contribution to the pool because we will die prematurely, and that may seem unjust, but part of the good of being in such a pool is perspective. It consists in the comfort of knowing that after a certain point, when you know that you need or want to cease working, you can. That is something that everyone in the pool stands to benefit from because this is a universal anxiety, whether they live to see retirement or not. Okay. So across arguments from productivity, desert, welfare, public goods, and the collective will, we've found several grounds on which the state might endorse the pension and embrace its work-discouraging effects while remaining committed to liberal neutrality. We may say that the pension is justified on welfarist grounds because it stands to alleviate normative deprivation for the elderly, and that it is justified on grounds of the common good because it unlocks key public goods that are otherwise difficult or prohibitive to secure. The old age pension promises to free up a scarce and valuable resource, which is the time of our elders. To their own benefit and ours, it makes the old more readily available for meaningful relationships with others. The old age pension is not the only policy that could secure such goods, but it's an elegant one. And in the final move of the paper, we considered whether a protected option to retire might also be something akin to a Rawlsian primary good that the state should help secure. This argument drew on several threads from earlier sections and served to justify the pension, not only by appeal to a particular conception of the good, but by reference to the rational structure of nearly universal human anticipation. So, all said and done, states have many worthy causes in which they can invest. It remains an open question as to whether these kind of foregoing considerations together or individually give the state sufficient reason to institute an old age pension, especially given the substantial costs of such programs. But I am, in closing, drawn back to that thought experiment from the second section of the paper, where we imagine people who fail to save for retirement being forced to work, even if in perfect health, until death. And I don't think I'm comfortable with such a scenario. But I'm also not sure that any of the arguments surveyed in this paper precisely capture why it fills me with unease, and nor am I sure that my moral repulsion for the scenario ultimately yields reasons for adopting a pension that are consistent with liberal neutrality. So I find myself in a situation a bit like Bismarck. So much the worse for liberal neutrality, I want to say. I'm tempted to say, call it socialism or whatever you like. It is the same to me. Okay, that's what I have.
Yes, now it's working. So we have like around 10 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Simone. I look forward to looking at the draft. I have lots of little notes here about each of the individual moves, and there were a lot of them in the presentation. They're excellent, really interesting stuff. But so I look forward to reading that to kind of give you feedback. But I have kind of a broader question related to the particular way in which you defend it and whether it tells us anything about the type of pension program we should have. So my inclination is basically I'm very friendly to your for your general theory about both the efficiency gains, and I think that the sort of offloading of security onto individuals is a big problem, and the collect against it. So your particular argument, does it tell us anything about the amounts that should be provided for a pension? What we're trying to figure out, what would be necessary in order to fill these goods? And does it tell us anything about the age of the person? And what's part of what's motivating this is the fact that old age pensions now in the United States, it's mostly due to healthcare costs, are eating the budget in wealthy democratic nations. And so that's sort of the background for that question.
Can you use the mic?
Yeah, so I was motivated in kind of taking on this project by thinking about the extent to which pensions are just this incredible burden on the state. I mean, it's the largest expenditure item in the annual budget, and I think that there are so there's something I want to work out about dignity, which I think favors the defined benefit. So that's a partial answer to the question about the amount, which is that I think that I favor, for reasons similar to the dignity advocates, the idea that the state should be guaranteeing a kind of common sufficiency-based amount to older workers, and that way it can be seen as a form of honor or social recognition rather than as a something that is directly proportional to their contributions, and then maybe that tells against defined contribution schemes rather than defined benefit schemes. So that says something about what model you want to use. But I mean, I think there is this interesting question about sufficiency is pretty mediocre. Is that actually does if part of the motivational set has to do with these kind of public goods type arguments, which I'm not super sympathetic to actually, I think on consideration, but then you might think well, no, you need to give people what they need to travel to see people and, to really meaningfully engage in relationships, and you need to support something more than sufficiency. So you need to target the sort of social functioning that you want people to have if you're trying to release the public goods, and then that's going to be even more onerous than existing pensions. So that's a fairly powerful consideration against that maybe. But yeah, and the age question's interesting too. I mean, I think one way in which the arguments that I've considered might deviate from the current model is that they don't clearly suggest that there should be an age at which the pension vests, and that's partly because I think that I'm sympathetic to the idea that we should be sensitive to people's relative sense of their scarcity of life years. But then you might think, okay, well, so like, do you do a defined entitlement of 30 years of like old age support or something? And that doesn't seem, yeah. So I think these are really important questions, and I don't think I have answers to them. And I can see ways in which different considerations favor different kinds of responses. But yeah, I mean, any ideas that you have would be helpful. I literally just finished writing this paper, so yeah.
So thanks. Mine is a question out of ignorance. I just read, don't ask me where, because I forgot, because I didn't pay attention, given I didn't expect this. An article about retirees in Japan.
About, sorry?
Retirees
in Japan.
in Japan.
Yep.
And they sort of have that magical pill that you described, in the sense that these are very elderly people, very healthy, and very bored. And so they want to go back to work. So there is a very large group of elderly who are working and looking for jobs. And they are very happy to go back to work because they don't want to be home, because they say, if I'm home, I'm going to die. So they want to work. And there are ways for them to find works that are different, jobs that are different from the one that they would do before. But in this article said, there is a challenge that I don't think I heard in your presentation, which is there is a gap between demand and supply of human capital. The skills that these elderly people have are no longer the skills that there is demand for. So that was something that I was curious to see how you would react to something like this.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I mean, I think one of the things that's distinct in this project from like the current system that we have, I mean, it's like framed within the US, but the current system of Social Security is that I really favor the idea of providing people with an option on retirement. But I also think that we should provide them with, like robust entitlements that enable them to stay in the workplace if they want to stay in the workplace. Because of these considerations like normative deprivation, because for some people, staying in the workplace is going to be their best route to a meaningful life. But for other people, it won't be. And so I think that there has to be a sensitivity to that. And that's why, and I think also like making it an option means that it's less likely to violate these kind of like liberal neutrality type concerns. So, but you're right that if you're sensitive to like these human capital worries about the old, or just like the environment of stigma that surrounds older workers, then you might think like what we need is a jobs guarantee for older workers, or we need reskilling, or we need a suite of social programs to support them remaining in the workplace if we want to maintain that as a live option. And again, then that's going to face some like serious, like we're going to have to weigh various goods in the budgetary process. But yeah, it's a really good point.
I just have a question and just kind of wondering about your thoughts. It kind of goes back a little bit to the age and the amount. Like with technology and so much being tracked, the surveillance capitalism, could something like pension become much more personalized? Like it would be different based on whatever, assuming not all jobs are going to be going away.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, would technology potentially enable more personalized answers to these kinds of questions? And if that's possible, is that a good thing, or is it still better to have some kind of baseline for everything?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So you think like, look, we now live in an age where the state can have like a bunch of information about people, and so it can do a kind, and in a way this already happens with some state benefit. So for pensions, so, if you're a firefighter, you have an option on retirement when you're 45 because, the nature of firefighting is onerous and exhausting or whatever. The military is similar. And so you might think like, look, we can look at all of these factors. We can look at the type of work. We can look at the likelihood that it's damaged the body. We can look at the individual person's health history, and we can come up with a function of that and then give them an individualized pension entitlement at the point where we think they will secure a similar benefit to some other person that's really interesting. I disfavor that. But I just favor that for kind of like just general commitment to liberalism reasons. So I think that like anytime the state collects that much data about citizens, it's bad for distinct reasons. And so even if that might be the optimally just thing to do, we shouldn't do it. Because I don't want the state knowing, and creating an algorithm that's like, that takes in my health data, my work history, all of these other things. The second reason, so that's a kind of like, tyranny worry that the state that has that much information about its citizens and feels entitled to act on it will slip into tyranny maybe, and that it's inappropriate for the liberal state to have that much information about individual citizens. The other kind of thought that I have is this dignity one, where I think it is really nice for it to be universal entitlement. And there is something to be said for like saying, and maybe this goes back to the point about dessert, like this is the point at which, we recognize you for your social contribution. We want to celebrate you, and this is an apt form of recognition. And then that maybe favors a single age, even if I don't know what the age is, to go back to Josh's question. So yeah, so I don't think I favor the individualized approach, but it's interesting, yeah.
And I have a last question, because you were talking about, well, this universal attempt at having this dignity argument. But several times you said this is things that we can think about, like in developed countries.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about segmented labor markets, or when you have, like most of Latin American countries, like more than 50% of the economy that's informal. So I know you're thinking about how to justify a pension scheme. I completely agree. Yeah. Now, I think we're pushing you to think how this can be sustainable, and what does universal dignity actually mean when you're thinking about a pension scheme in certain specific global economic conditions.
Yeah, no, this is like a huge, very important question. I mean, I've been taking it as an assumption that the pension is in a sense work tested, like, like as in Social Security, it pays out as a function of age and work history. But when you have informal labor markets, you don't have that information about, who is a quote unquote worker and who is not. And so that like kind of defined benefit program that's indexed to work history becomes unworkable or unjust. And so you might think like then you should have a system of universal entitlements that's just for any adult having reached an age where work doesn't figure, but then you lose access maybe to some of the like other arguments, or the ones about desert at least, because you know that there are a significant proportion of the people in the cohort that are receiving the benefit maybe that weren't workers, and so there's a question about how you characterize it, like just having a generic old age benefit. Yeah, but I think these are like, I mean, the bigger problem is just a pragmatic problem, which is that pension programs are incredibly expensive, and they should maybe be a human right. But yeah, their realization in non-OECD countries is like, I mean, it's like driving OECD countries into the ground as well. But yeah.
Like half a minute.
Okay. Well, thanks, Simone. I think it's amazing. And I just have a quick question. It's outside of the discussion, but do you think how relevant is the concept of work and productivity here to understand this part? Do you have like a cultural US understand about what that means? Why I say that? Because it's about informal workers and about being productivity. Like in Brazil, if you have a 65 for women and 74 years old for men, you'll receive a pension.
Yeah.
So it's not related with being productivity. So it's sounds like a different approach, a way to see the point. So do you think it's relevant to understand the idea behind, the cultural idea behind
Yeah.
what it means productivity, work, and yeah.
No, absolutely. So I completely agree. This is like, I thought this a lot when I was reading the dessert material, like that this is so American. These arguments. So what, like, I mean, this is part of a larger project where I read New Deal era texts and interact with like moral arguments that they suggest. And so they index to this kind of like cultural context. But there's like definitely like some weird Protestant, you know, work ethic ideology happening when you are characterizing the worker as someone who makes a distinctive sort of social contribution that's due special recognition, and non-workers are not due that. That like builds in a whole set of assumptions that you could like reasonably be completely unsympathetic to in a different cultural context. Yeah.
So thank you, Simone, and let's move on.
Yeah. Good morning. We will begin our second section today and our last section in person. So with Jimena Hurtado from the Universidad de los Andes and Maria Pia Paganelli from the Trinity University. Thanks so much for accept our invitation, and please, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much for inviting us here. Um, So the title is a little bit different, just a little, from the title that we submitted originally, mostly because this is a long project that we had. Jimena has worked a lot on statics economics, and this was a long time ago, and she was presenting a paper about that, and she mentioned the poor man's son, and I was like, Jimena, I've been thinking about the poor man's son, we should do something together, and then we said yes, yes, and it's been sitting in the closet for the longest time, and then when this came up, I was like, Jimena, let's go. And she was like, yes, poor man's son, perfect. But then there was like a sort of paper with 2 papers in it. And so we eventually separated the papers. And so the bread part is not bread alone, is a different paper than this one. So we just had this situation. So it's a little bit different title from the original, but the content is the same. I have no idea who you are. So this paper is about a figure in Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. And I don't know if you know Adam Smith. I don't know if you know, you do? All of you? Yes? Most, okay. Do you know who the poor man's son is? No, okay. So Adam Smith wrote Theory of Moral Sentiments before writing The Wealth of Nations. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, there is a story about a poor man's son, and he is cursed with ambition. So he sees a rich person and wants to have the same thing as a rich person, thinking that is going to be happier if he has the same thing as a rich person. So he works very, very, very hard all his life. And then by the time he's old, he looks back at his life and says, why? Right. I worked so hard. I troubled myself so much. For what? And Smith ends the story by saying the poor man's son sort of seems to regret his life, and a beggar who suns himself on the side of the road has that tranquility that a king fights for. Right? So it seems that the poor man's son is a very tragic character. Everybody in the literature presents him as a very tragic figure. It's a very sad story because you work very, 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 very hard, and at the end of your life you say, I would have been just as well off in my poverty. And so what we look at is whether it is true, or if there is another way to understand the poor man's son. And what we suggest is that there is. And the poor man's son is actually a very positive character. It's not a sad story, it's a happy story. The poor man's son is a success story. And what Smith is doing is actually criticizing the critics of the poor man's son. So I'm going to ask, no, that's okay. I'm going to ask you some personal questions. So I need your answers. Do you make your bed in the morning? Never? Do you have somebody that makes it for you? No. No? Yes? You make it. You make it? You make it for. Do you make your bed? No. No. So you're the only one who makes a bed, sorry. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Why do you make your bed? Yeah. Why do you make the bed? Do you make the bed as well? You said no. No. So the picture is like an unmade bed and a made bed. Which one would you pick? The made bed. Why? is nicer, it looks more comfortable. Why does it look more comfortable? So that's the puzzle, right? It's like a bed functions as a bed, regardless whether it's made or not made. So if you just care about sleeping, it doesn't make a difference whether the bed is made or not made. This is why I assume you don't make the bed, right? Because making the bed takes effort. And so it's a waste of time, it's a waste of resources to make the bed. But you make the bed because it's nice to look at the bed well done. This is why, even if you don't make your own bed, you want to sleep in the bed that is well done, well made. Both are very comfortable. They're the same bed. But you prefer to sleep in the one that is well done because it looks more comfortable, not because it is more comfortable. And the gentleman here makes his own bed because he likes the way it looks. And so we can have two reasons for making or not making the bed. If we make the bed and we evaluate making the bed with a utilitarian point of view, is a waste of time. Because a bed made and a bed unmade are equally comfortable. So if you think in terms of utility, it makes no sense to make the bed. And sorry, can you, Josh. And Josh is a loser because he spent so much time making his bed when he could just leave it as is, go back at night and be perfectly comfortable. But if we instead work with an aesthetic principle, then it makes perfect sense to make the bed. And actually, it makes no sense not to make the bed, because when you see a bed undone, just like this one, you look at it and you're like, ooh, I don't want to be in that room. I want to be in the other room. So if we use an aesthetic explanation, making the bed makes sense. If we use a utility explanation, not making the bed makes sense. And making the bed makes no sense. I'm going to try with a different example, see if it works. This is a challenge, and I don't know if it works. I have nothing here to use as an example. Jimena, stand up. Do you like the shawl that Jimena has? What if I told you that the shawl is handmade of silk? Does it change your evaluation of it? Do you think it's more beautiful or less beautiful? Gentleman says, more beautiful. More beautiful or less beautiful if I told you that the shawl is handmade silk? You think, well, wow, impressed. What if I told you instead that the shawl is polyester bought in the street? Now you think of the shawl and say, me. Yeah? Does it change the way in which you look at the shawl? Yes. It's the same shawl, though. Right? Smith has an example, and that's a picture there, of two gentlemen in a party looking at the headdress of a woman that is full of jewelry. And one is very impressed by it. It's like, oh, she must be a princess because of all the diamonds that she has. And then a jeweler next to him says, actually, that's fake. Those are fake diamonds. And the guy who thought the woman was a princess with this beautiful headdress, like, yeah, she's just like common. So knowing whether something is real or not makes a difference, even though it is the same thing, right? So again, if you think that an original is better than a fake, then you have to figure out why that is the case. If you think in terms of utility, again, whether the head address is a fake one or an original one, it doesn't matter. If you think that the Jimeno shawl is a beautiful shawl, it doesn't matter whether it is polyester or handmade silk. It's still a beautiful shawl. Or it's something that covers her, like just decorates her, like in the case of the headdress. But if you think in terms of beauty, then you think, oh, silk is better than polyester. Real diamonds are better than fake diamonds, even though they look the same. So again, if you use a utility criteria, you have a certain judgment that is going to be different than if you use an aesthetic criteria. And with a utility criteria, it doesn't matter. You're saying it's silly to spend so much money on a silk shawl when you can get a polyester one for 1/10 of the price. But if you think in terms of aesthetics, it makes perfect sense to buy the fancy one and not the fake one. I assume that you all have a job, right? Why? Why aren't you volunteering at your university? Josh, I put you on the stop. Why don't you volunteer at your university? You can do exactly the same thing without pay. Why is it helpful? You can get food even without paying, right? There's a lot of, especially if you live in the US, there's a lot of shelters that offer you food, offer you clothes, offer you housing. Again, well, put the kids aside for a second, but it still works even with children. You have food, clothing, and shelter for free. But you say your food, your shelter, and your clothes are better. Again, if you use a utility of explanation, it shouldn't make a difference whether you're looking at your house or the shelter. Still housing. But if you're looking at an aesthetic explanation, you think my house is better than the shelter. But in both cases, you're going to have a roof. In both cases, you're going to have food. You're not going to starve to death, right? So the same thing, depending on how what the criteria that you use is going to be giving you a positive or negative answer. So in the case of the poor man's son, again, if we use a utility criteria, we are going to have a certain kind of pictures. If, on the other hand, we're using an aesthetic criteria, we're going to have a different picture. So if we evaluate the poor man's son with a utility criteria, he's a loser. He's a failure. He's delusioned. But if we use the aesthetic criteria to evaluate the poor man's son, then the poor man's son is a success story. The poor man's son is Josh who makes his bed, right? Is somebody who works hard to make the bed because it looks better. If we instead use the utility criteria, Josh is a loser, just like the poor man's son, because he spends so much time in making the bed. It's like, why? You can go to sleep in the same unmade bed. You're perfectly comfortable anyway. So depending on how you're looking at the poor man's son, you see different stories. Smith introduces his poor man's son with a different example. It tells us that there are some people that walk into a room. So this is a cartoon just because we don't have anything better, and it's a cute one that Jimena generated with the AI. So Smith tells us, you walk into a room and you find all the chairs piled up in the center of the room, what do? Well, you move the chairs so that they are now nicely ordered, and then you're so tired, you sit down, you're like, oh. And it's like, you could have sat down in the chair in the middle of the room without any problems. You could have walked through the room even if there were chairs in the middle. But you choose to put the chairs on the side, on the walls, because you want to have a nice looking room. Even if you're so tired that then you have to sit down on the chair and complain how tired you are because you have to do all the work. So again, if we think in terms of utility, the guy who arranges the chairs is a failure, is wasting their time. But if you think in terms of aesthetics, it makes no sense to leave the chairs in the middle of the room. And so the poor man's son comes right after this. And Smith says the poor man's son looks at the rich person in a carriage. And he thinks, oh, it would be so nice to be in a carriage. And he looks at the rich, at the palace in which the rich lives, and says, I don't want to be in my poor cottage. I want to live in a palace as well. And so we have, is that clicker? No. So we have, sorry, I'm gonna come here. I found this, I actually love this because of the swimming pool. Yeah. So it is, I don't know if it's Rio or São Paulo, but it is one of the favelas here in Brazil. And they have a swimming pool. And then there is another house with a swimming pool. If you have to choose which house are you going to live, which one are you going to choose? The bigger one. Why? It seems more comfortable. It has a pool, but also the other one has a pool. It has a roof. The other one also has a roof, right? So the two houses fulfill the same role. They're equally useful to protect yourself against the elements and to give you the basic comfort of life. They fulfill the same purpose, but you prefer the palace. Does anybody wants to go in the swimming pool on the roof? What? Oh, because there's, well. No, well, I didn't think of the people, but yeah, there's, I can put some people where you can invite more people in the bigger house, that's true. But the poor man's son is attracted by the bigger house because it looks more comfortable. Falling down. And it doesn't want to be in his father's cottage because it doesn't look as comfortable. And Smith is explicit about this. It tells us the cottage, the poor's cottage, and the palace give us the same utility. But what differs between them is that the elegance of the palace is what attracts us to the palace. So it's not necessarily more comfortable, but it's more beautiful. So in terms of comfort, both the cottage and the palace does it. Same. But the elegance is not the same. The beauty is not the same. And what we want is not comfort, it's beauty. And if beauty is what we want, then the poor man's son is doing the right thing, is pursuing beauty. And Smith says, would it make sense if you were in a desert island to build a palace? It doesn't, right? In the desert island, it's okay to be in a cottage. But, and it would be a waste of time and resources to build your palace. Oops, sorry. And the palace is visible. You will remember the big house if you walk by it. But it's going to be very difficult to distinguish the little house in the favelas with the swimming pool on top from another one. Smith is very explicit about this. Poverty gives you invisibility. You don't want to look at poor. You want to ignore the poor. You don't want them to be in your sight. What you want to look at are the rich. So if you're poor, you're going to be invisible. And if you're rich, you're going to instead be very visible. And what Smith tells us in other parts of Theory of Moral Sentiments, that we want to be seen. We want to be liked. We want to be admired for good reasons, not necessarily for bad reasons, for good reasons. But nevertheless, we are social beings. So we need to have the interactions with others. We don't want to be not seen and ignored. And so a palace does that work. Because when we walk by a big house, we look at the big house and say, whoa, wow. But when we walk by a favelas, it's like, oh, okay. And not necessarily something that we pay too much attention to distinguish one little house from the other. So pursuing wealth like the poor man's son does, is not a delusion. Is actually a very successful way to achieve recognition and to achieve beauty, which gives us recognition. In addition, the poor man's son works very hard. There is nothing in that story that tells us that it does something wrong. It doesn't steal, it doesn't kill, it doesn't deceive other people, it doesn't lie, it just works very hard. Which is something that Smith says deserves approbation. So not only he receives the approbation because of his wealth when he actually gets out of poverty, but he deserves that approbation. And so in this sense, the poor man's son is a success story, because he's doing the things that actually brings him approbation, deservingly so. It brings him wealth, brings him the comfort of beauty. But the problem is that in that passage, Smith tells us that the poor man's son at the end of his life is complaining about how hard he worked. And that's usually how it is interpreted as a very negative story. It's like, it's a failure, right? But it is at the end of his life, when he is reduced by spleen or disease. So when you're sick, when you're about to die, when you're in a very, 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 very dark mood, you look back at your life and it's like, why? Why did I do all this thing? Why did I do the bed every morning? But you say that only at the end of your life, or if you're very sick. Smith tells us immediately after this that when you are in regular health, in good humor, we are charmed with the beauty and admire the pleasure of wealth and greatness. They are grand, beautiful, and noble, and it is well worth the toil and anxiety to get them. Okay. So our normality is Josh, who makes his bed every day. That's what is normal. The exception is when, if you are ever sick, or if you're ever like in a rush and you're like, I have to make the bed, and you make the bed, and then you're like, oh, I'm late, right? Then you're like, ah, that's a different situation. Or when you're very sick and you're like, oh, I'm making the bed, I'm exhausted, why did I make the bed, right? But those are the exceptions. The normality is I'm going to make the bed because it's worth making it, because it's so beautiful to have a clean room. That's a poor man's son. So what Smith is doing is actually criticizing the philosophers who are saying, oh, you're working so hard, for what? You'd be better off being like a beggar who sun themselves on the side of the street. But if that is the case, do you want to be a beggar? Do you really want to be the beggar who suns himself on the side of the street? Josh, who's making his bed every morning, doesn't want to be in a shelter, doesn't want to be a beggar. You don't make your bed in the morning. Do you want to be a beggar? You're going to be tranquil. But your kids can be tranquil too. Right? But Smith says in different places, we look with horror at beggars. We despise beggars. And again, those are hard words, but we'd rather be with normal people than with beggars. Is it really true that beggars who sun themselves on the side of the road have no anxiety? Because that's the implication of that passage where Smith says, oh, the splendid philosophers are saying, oh, you're working so hard all your life, you think it's a waste of time, it's a waste of your life. You should sun yourself on the side of the road like a beggar because the beggar is tranquil. But are they really tranquil? Are beggar really without all the anxiety that the poor man's son had? And it's difficult to think that that is indeed the case. Especially in Smith's framework, when we said we look at a poor and we actually look away if we see a poor. It's difficult to give compassion to poor. So if that's the case, then the poor man's son is indeed a success story. It's not a tragedy, it's not a failure, it's actually a great positive story. And what Smith is criticizing is not the poor man's son, but actually the Planatic philosophers who are criticizing the poor man's son. Thank you. And I leave all the questions to Jimena.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, amazing. Thank you. Now we have time for our discussion.
Hi, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. I guess I have a question. So sometimes when I've read Smith and he's talking about the relative, interest that we have in the lives of the rich, it's almost like a prurient interest. I feel like there's a moral critique that's latent sometimes in these descriptions where he says, we feel with the rich, they're suffering more acutely than we feel the poor. And I almost feel like he's trying to identify a kind of bias that we have or a blindness that we have that means that we're insensitive to the actual facts of the world, that the poor are less well off and they're equally deserving of compassion, but because of our weird, aspirational preference to be rich, we just look at the rich all the time and we ignore the poor and we don't show them the respect they're due. And so I wonder, that then there's something like, it's like a function that the rich play in society that is one that like they blind us. We should be worried about growing inequality. And so I wonder about the poor man's son being a success story, because, you know, the more of us that become like the poor man's son, like the blinder we become, you know, like we're just like giving ourselves over to this aspirational side of ourselves, which also like functions to morally, you know, corrode us or something. Yeah.
I answer. Sure. I start, you finish. How's that? So at the end of the passage of the poor man's son, Smith says, "It is well that nature deluded us in this way, because it is his ambition that actually drives us to build highways in the sea, to transform deserts into, no, I make it up. I forgot exactly what he's saying, but like to transform land into fertile land, right? So we are able actually to create more things that makes us better off. So without that admiration for the rich, the poor man's son would stay poor, would have less material things, which you can say, well, I don't care. But in Smith's time, that is important, because Smith is actually facing, well, maybe not the poor man's son himself, but one of the concerns that Smith has in terms of material production is the fact that there is absolute poverty, right? And so a woman in the Highlands of Scotland has 12 children, and only 2 of them survive to maturity. In the introduction of The Wealth of Nations, he tells us that there are societies that are so poor that you're forced to abandon your children, your elderly, and your sick to be devoured by wild beasts. So you do need that kind of material production so that you can support the life of everybody. And in addition, to allow more people to live, we also are social beings, right? So we do care about how people look at each other. I do care how you evaluate me, in Smith's framework at least. And so if you look down at me, I am going to be devastated. I want to have your recognition, for good or bad. But like, given that this is our human nature, according to Smith, it is a good thing that I pursue beautiful things so that I can actually achieve that love that otherwise I wouldn't receive.
Mobility is disgust for your own family. Like, it's like, you know, like the poor man's son has to think that his father has lived his life ill, or that he's not worthy of compassion. You know, like I mean, I find all of that really moving, but then there's something horrible about our constitution, that we have to like hate the people around us in order to aspire, you know, like we have to have an outsized affection for those who are higher than us, and disdain for our own family when we come from humble contexts.
That's not what Smith says.
Okay.
Right? So Smith never says that the poor man's son hates his father. He says he doesn't like the house in which his father lives, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't like his father.
So I'll start with the last part. Smith does clearly say in the same chapter where he's talking about the poor man's son that we do not judge of people as we judge of things. So I don't think that there's a big literature about how Smith's morals are aesthetic also. And yes, we can admire the beauty of character, but that does not lead to a moral judgment. So I think there's a difference there that cannot be just forgotten. And then the other thing I wanted to say is there is also something very powerful, I think, in what Smith is saying in social mobility, because what he tells us in the lectures of jurisprudence, well, not him, but his students, is that the taste of beauty is universal, so that we all have that drive towards beauty. And so that would mean that the poor man's son is kind of showing us the way that in a certain institutional arrangement, it is possible to have our taste of beauty satisfied.
Thanks. Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Jimena. Just a quick question is, I I disagree a little bit about the poor man sons is a success story because sounds like for me the poor man and the beggar they are in the same boat some way. Like when you mention about anxiety, like the a beggar is suffer too. It's it's both are suffering for the same or looking for the same idea. So I think there is something behind about what means a good life or what you're looking for, what in that story that's for me is I'm concerned about that. I can understand like the poorest man is better than the beggar in some way, but both are in the same boat looking for something that sounds sad when you reduce a good life or an idea about what is important, what's matter in that way. There is a philosophical concern, but I don't know. Do you have any comments about that?
The poor man's son is anxious or thought he was anxious at the end of his life. Right. So that's again is when you're very sick and you try to make your bed and you're exhausting yourself and you're sitting down after you made your bed, it's like, why I did this. Right? But when you're healthy, you make your bed, it's like, oh, look how beautiful it is. Right? So I think that that's what Smith is telling you. Like the poor man's son thinks that he had anxiety all his life, but he thinks that only at the end of his life when he's sick and derelict. It doesn't necessarily tell us that he actually felt the way throughout his life. And indeed, before he says, like, no, this is beautiful. I'm doing something that is so beautiful. So Josh is very happy when he finishes his bed. He looks at this room and says, nice. Yes, it's troublesome. It takes time, but it's worth it. Look how beautiful it is. Right? So I think that is a passage through which you read the poor man's son, not at the end of his life. In normal circles, like in better health and better humor, it doesn't tell us that the poor man's son was sick the entire life. It's just at the end of his life that he's sick and is about to die and he knows it and he's looked back and it's like, why did I trouble myself so much? But otherwise, the anxiety is worth it. Then if you are in the same boat because you also have anxiety about paying your bills, then why don't you live in a shelter? Then you don't have to pay your bills. No, it does, because it's the same problem. Like you want to have your house, like you want to have your own clothes, you want to choose your clothes, you want to have a certain things for your son. You could have the same thing in the shelter, but you choose to have better things with anxiety because you think this is better. Why is it better? Because the quality of your clothes, the quality of your food, the quality of education that you can give to your children is more beautiful.
Thanks. I wanted to ask. Oh, oh, sorry. I wanted to ask about. There's the claim about doing things because it's beautiful, and there's my aesthetic judgment as the person who's making these decisions. But I was curious about about other people and like what role the judgments about beauty that other people are making, and like whether that is more of a driver of these things than so like you said earlier on, a cottage is fine on a deserted island. Maybe spending all day in tranquility is fine on a deserted island. But my aesthetic judgments are probably the same on the deserted island as they are here. The difference is whether people are around to observe. So how much is building the palace because I find the palace beautiful, and how much of it is because I anticipate that other people will find it beautiful, and what I care about is the judgments of other people. In which case, to bring it back to making the bed, I make the bed when someone's coming over. I just don't make the bed when it's just me because I don't, So I'm just wondering how motivated we really are should be by other people's judgments.
For Smith, we are social beings. So I cannot tell you if I am doing the right thing or the wrong thing if I am by myself without growing up. It's not possible. But imagining that I grew up away from civilization, from society, from others, how can I tell whether I do the right thing or the wrong thing? How can I tell whether something is beautiful or not beautiful? How can I tell whether I'm tall or short? Right? Whether I can see well or not see well. So Smith tells us all our judgments come from the interactions with other people. So I judge my side by your side. And we can both can take off glasses and see which one sees the fathers. But without my comparison with you, I will never know that I don't see well. Until you tell me, no, I can see farther away than you, right? And so I judge my side by your side, my nose by your nose, my height by your height, whether something I do is right or wrong, depending on how you react to what I do, whether you approve what I do or whether you don't approve what I do. Same thing with beauty. There's nothing intrinsic in beauty, in objects. It's the social construct that tells us this is beautiful, this is not beautiful.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm not a philosopher or anything. I'm just very interesting to look at the Adam Smith. The only thing I know is the Wealth of Nation. But I'm just wondering what's the societal impact on this theory, because I can see just for personal background, I'm from Korea, so I can see from 50s Korean 50 to 80s. This is basically how Korean. I feel like the Korean has the embodiment of this story about trying to look up the America, Europe, and trying to see how we want to success. However, I think that's a good time for that time. But however, I feel like at this moment, this theory probably expired in Korea. So I'm just wondering whether you have any comment about whether this theory is only applicable for certain regions, certain period of time, or can be universally applicable for any time period.
I think there are two things to consider. One is what is our nature, and the other one is what are the institutional settings into which we live. And so for Smith, human nature is constant. So it's the same everywhere all the time. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Korea today, in Korea in the 60s, in Korea in year 1000, or if you are in Italy in year 1000, in Italy today, in Italy in year 3000. It doesn't matter. You can be anywhere in the world at any time. We're all the same. Our structure is the same, right? So this desire to, with this attraction to beauty, this desire to interact with others and receiving their approbation because of the beauty that we have is universal. It's just that in certain situations, it's easier to fulfill than in others. So the Poor Man's Son is a story of social mobility, as somebody mentioned, which is possible in a commercial society. Right? It's not something, Smith gives us different types of societies. There's like a pastoral society, an agricultural society, sorry, let me put them in order. Hunter society, pastoral society, agricultural society, and commercial society. The Poor Man's Son story would not be applicable in a hunting society. Just because there's no property, like the only thing you can do is to hunt, but whatever you hunt goes bad after a few days, like, so that's it. It makes, you can't have accumulation of capital in a hunting society. So, and there is no social mobility because everybody is equally poor. So there is nowhere to go just because everybody is on the same level. So despite the fact that the drive of the Poor Man's Son is present among hunters as well, in hunters cannot be fulfilled just because the institutional context is not the same. So I think what the story is telling us is that, yes, it is possible to have the Poor Man's Son in a commercial society because the institutions are such that allow for that social mobility. In a feudal society, you can aspire to have a palace as much as you want, but if you're poor, you're going to be stuck. You can't go up. So that doesn't mean that in a different institutional context, the incentives are such that you either are not able to do it or there are other factors that play a role. But in this particular context, it works.
Yeah. Oh, Josh.
I don't know if this doesn't really affect your argument against splenetic philosophy and much of what you said about recognition, but I wonder what's tripping some people up here a little bit is something, and I'm not sure if I'm asking this question about Smith or about your using of Smith or just our general way of thinking, is that there's something about the palace that yields not that there isn't an aesthetic improvement, but there's something about a lack of proportion or a lack of balance or something like that that's kind of capturing our negative feelings about aspiring for the palace as opposed to aspiring for beauty. And I don't think any of that's necessarily relevant to making the points that you're making, but I think that's kind of what we're picking up here a little bit when we're having reluctance, as well as Smith's just general being concerned about too much emulation of the rich as well. But like, yeah. So it's not really a question. It's more of like, I think that's tripping us up, and maybe you're just working with Smith's examples. So, but I wonder if that's.
Mm-hmm. So in the passage of the Poor Man's Son, Smith uses a palace. Like the Poor Man's Son wants a palace, like he wants a carriage. The palace, though, is elegant. It's not out of proportion. So I think is elegance. So this is actually a beautiful palace. It's not something outrageous. Like there are certain things that are out of proportion, and it's correct. And mm-hmm. So there are, I think, two ways of approaching the question. One is we have an innate desire to better our condition, and that we take it from birth to the grave. So you can think like, yes, I want to better my condition. I want a bigger palace, a bigger palace, a bigger palace, a bigger palace. So that's part of the story. The other part of the story, which I think is what you're aiming at, is like, what do I do to get that palace? How do I get the palace? The poor man's son works very hard. But again, there is no mention that is doing anything wrong. On the other hand, and this is in the Wealth of Nations, merchants and manufacturers, they also are very rich, and they're getting richer and richer. So their palaces are really huge palaces. But the way in which they achieve their wealth is through lobbying, monopolies, encouraging wars. Of course, monopoly means higher prices, so restricting trade, which is decreasing economic growth. And they are heavily criticized. Right? So there are different ways of achieving wealth, of achieving your palace. And the poor man's son is doing it in the right way. The merchant and manufacturer, the East Indian Company officials are not doing it in the right way. And Smith is very strong in criticizing them. So the way in which he describes the officials of the East Indian Company is that they grab as much as they can, and they leave their post, they leave the country with all that wealth, leaving behind a destruction that is equivalent of an earthquake, and they don't look back. And if you look at how Smith handles earthquake in the theory of moral sentiments, he tells you, if you know that the entire population of China is going to be destroyed tomorrow, and China is just because it's so far away, right? It's people that you don't know, what are you going to do? And he says, well, you're going to feel sorry for them, but then you're going to sleep without problems throughout the night. If you're told that tomorrow you're going to lose your little finger, how are you going to sleep? He said, you're not going to sleep. You're going to be so terrified. But if you're told that if you give up your little finger, you will prevent the earthquake in China that will destroy the entire population, what would you do? And Smith says, there is not a villain on earth that would keep the little finger and let the population of China die. Right? And then in the Wealth of Nations, it tells you the East Indian Company official caused the earthquake and walk away without looking back. That's a very strong moral criticism that is giving us of that kind of accumulation of wealth, that kind of palace. So to achieve their palaces in that way is a very bad way. But to do it in the poor man's son way, you just do it honestly, you just work very hard, you move up in the social hierarchy or social approbation, that's perfectly fine. So I think maybe that is part of what. Okay.
So we don't have more time for questions. We are late. Thank you so much.
estou tão sozinho. Ah, que tudo é tão triste. A beleza que existe, a beleza que não é só minha, que passa sozinha.
Deixe de graça e fica mais lindo por causa do amor. Por causa do amor.
Esse é o som que a gente está escutando. Alô? Testando o som?
Por causa do amor. Por causa do amor. Por causa do amor.
Se ela soubesse que quando ela passa, o mundo inteirinho se enche de graça e fica mais lindo por causa do amor. Do amor. Vai, minha tristeza, e diz a ela que sem ela não pode ser. Diz-lhe numa prece que ela regresse, porque eu não posso mais sofrer.
Chega de saudade. A realidade é que sem ela não há paz, não há beleza. Tristeza, melancolia, não sai de mim, não sai de mim, não sai.
Mas ela voltar, que coisa linda, que coisa louca, pois há menos peixinhos a nadar no mar, os peixinhos que eu dar sua boca.
Dentro dos meus braços, os abraços.
De ser milhões de abraços, apertado assim, colado assim, calado assim, abraços e beijinhos e carinhos sem ter fim. E é pra acabar com esse negócio de você viver sem mim. Tristeza, melancolia, não sai de mim, não sai de mim, não sai. Os meus braços, os abraços, de ser milhões de abraços, apertado assim, colado assim, calado assim, abraços e beijinhos e carinhos sem ter fim. É pra acabar com esse negócio de você viver sem mim. Não quero mais esse negócio de você longe de mim. Vamos deixar esse negócio de você viver sem mim.
É pau, é pedra, é o fim do caminho, é um resto de topo, é um pouco sozinho, é um caco de vidro, é a vida, é o sol, é a noite, é a morte, é o laço, é o anzol, é peroba do campo, é o nó do madeiro, caingá, candeia, é o matita pereira, é madeira de vento, tombo da ribanceira, é o mistério profundo, é o queira ou não queira, é o vento ventando, é o fim da ladeira, é a vinha, é o vão, festa da cumbieira, é a chuva chovendo, é conversa ribeira das águas de março, é o fim da canseira, é o pé, é o chão, é a marcha estradeira, passarinho na mão, pedra de atiradeira.
Uma ave no céu, uma ave no chão, é um regato, é uma ponte, é um pedaço de pão.
É o fundo do poço, é o fim do caminho, no rosto o desgosto, é um pouco sozinho, é um estrepe, é um prego, é uma ponte, é um ponto, é um pingo pingando, é uma ponta, é um conto.
É um peixe, é um gente, é uma prata brilhando, é a luz da manhã, é o tijolo chegando.
É a lenha, é o dia, é o fim da picada, é a garrafa de cano, o estilhaço na estrada.
É o projeto da casa, é um corpo na cama, é um carro enguiçado, é a lama, é a lama.
É um passo,
é uma ponte,
é um sapo,
é uma rã,
é um resto,
de mato,
a luz.
da manhã, são as águas de março, fechando o verão, é a promessa de vida no teu coração. É uma cobra, é um pau.
É João, é José, é um espinho na mão, é um corte no pé.
São as águas de março, fechando o verão, é a promessa de vida no teu coração.
É pau, é pedra, é o fim do caminho, é um resto de topo, é um pouco sozinho.
É um passo, é uma chama Sapamã. É um belo horizonte, uma febre terça. São as águas de março fechando o verão. É promessa de vida no teu coração.
Yes. Okay. Now, can you? Eu acho, I think ele consegue me ouvir, mas a gente não consegue ouvir ele. Aham. Okay. Let's try again. Hey, Mike, can you say hello to see if I can hear you? I'm not sure. Can you hear me? Oi, teste.
E testando.
Uhum. Ok. Eu acho que ele consegue me ouvir. A gente que não tá ouvindo ele. Uhum. Try again. Hey. Hi, Michael. Can you hear me? No. Can you say a few words? Can you say hello? No. Eu acho que eu vou escrever para ele. A gente deixa aqui pertinho e o microfone vai captando, eu acho. Ok. Sei. Foi. Let me see. Ei.
Hey, hey, I can. Can you hear me? Oh, great. All right, we worked our way around it. Likewise. Oh, yeah, 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 absolutely. Sure, sure, sure. It's how are you doing? You had a lot of work ahead of you, didn't you? Oh, that would be great. I know. It looks like you had a great list of speakers coming down, and you also I like. Hello, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. And you?
Good, thank you.
I will introduce you, and then I will pass the microphone for questions.
Terrific.
And
And I have about
I think
34 minutes, is that?
the slot is an hour.
Oh, the
So
slot
the
is an
more
hour.
you speak, the less question there will be.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
That sounds great.
And I don't think I introduced myself, so just because you're there. My name is Maria Pia Paganelli. I'm from Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas.
Oh, okay.
And our speaker, now I'm introducing you to our audience, is Michael Buckley. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
From Lehman College in CUNY, and is going to talk to us about 2 ways to think about human rights. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you. And I have a slide that I will share, a little slide deck. Well, I just want to thank you for having me. Thank you to the organizers, Evandro, Thais, and Vanya, and I obviously wish I could be there. I think you guys had a great symposium with a lot of great speakers, and it looks like you also have some built-in time for some fun. So naturally, I wish I could be there, but I'm really happy to be able to talk to you today. And just a little bit about me. So I mostly work in political philosophy and kind of traditional analytic political philosophy, but I have also an interest in business ethics and human rights. And this presentation brings those three strands a bit together. And so I haven't really presented on this before, but they're parts of different projects that I am working on. And one of the reasons for why I'm interested in human rights is a theoretical reason, because it really sort of focuses on one of the enduring questions that I'm most interested in, and that is a question about the relationship between political principles and facts. Some people, like you think of Rousseau or Rawls, they think that our fundamental political principles are justified by, the conditions of life as we know them or not at all. So they very much want to work in those factual considerations into the way they think about the justification of political principles. And I'm very sympathetic, I'll put my cards out there. I'm very sympathetic to that view. I think that there's something right about that. But there are, other views coming from as far back as Plato, but also critics like G.A. Cohen who don't think that we learn anything fundamental about justice by looking at these conditions of what's permissible to coerce, but rather we know what's permissible to coerce by consulting our moral principles that are true independent of those factual considerations. And I happen to think that that line of criticism against the Rousseau's or Rawls of the world is actually quite insightful and incisive. And so I'm really interested in my own political work in thinking about how both those things can be sort of true at once. And that gives you an indication of the title of this presentation, Two Ways of Thinking About Human Rights, because human rights, I think, are a good example of what Cohen is talking about, and a good example of why we need moral principles to tell us which considerations count as good reasons for some kind of political action. So that's one reason why I'm really interested in human rights and interested in talking about that today. But there's another really practical reason for why I'm interested in talking about human rights, and it just has to do with the fact that the human rights practice is really on the ropes. It's really being threatened in many different ways. And a lot of people in the practice are uncertain how to move forward, are in some cases disillusioned about the practice. And so I think we need to think theoretically about it in ways that speak to these practical concerns. I'm also at Lehman College, the director of the Center for Human Rights and Peace Studies, and I can't say I'm fully plugged into the practice of human rights, but I am somewhat plugged in. I do have broader connections to the field within the New York City area. I belong to CUNY's broader human rights hub, which includes people at Human Rights Watch and the ACLU. I know people at Columbia's Human Rights Center. I know practitioners in New York. And there's a real worry about America's withdrawal of leadership in not just human rights, but the rule of law in general around the world. They're also worried about funding and the withdrawal of funding for human rights work. It's really impacting a lot of people's professional lives, but there are also other considerations, just practical considerations, like the way in which the UN's Commission on Human Rights is set up, and how sometimes just the functioning of it undermines the normative force of human rights. And even some people who are in the practice who have become disillusioned with the way human rights discourse has expanded to include entitlements that they aren't quite sure ought to be included in human rights discourse. So there's both a theoretical and a practical set of concerns that have motivated this particular talk. And so let me just start by saying, when I talk about human rights, what I'm talking about. So this comes from the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights, and it just says human rights are rights that we have simply because we exist as human beings. They are not granted by any state. These are universal rights, are inherent to us all. So, I mean, that's the generic idea of human rights. I'm interested in this particular talk, this idea of universal individual rights that are that we have in virtue of being human. And you know, there are then two questions, and this gets back to what I was saying earlier about my theoretical interests. Two questions, or one question you might ask about universal human rights. And you might say, you know, are these, how should we think about these principles? Are they evaluative standards, by which I mean universal moral standards that apply across contexts and are valid independently of the institutional or factual considerations appropriate to the context? And do they just tell us how to, you know, how to think about what's right and wrong, even when thinking about what's right or wrong might not have any practical significance? And I think that's a plausible view, especially given the definition I just gave of human rights, and also how they tend to function in our own moral political discourse. Or are they what I'm just calling operational principles for the moment, which are kind of more substantive normative standards that are formulated for contexts of social action, and maybe they're modified or adjusted partly from the factual considerations associated with that context that we're talking about. And importantly, they tell us not just what to think, but also what to do in a particular action. Now, I use these terms of evaluative standards, operational principles. Maybe these aren't the best ways to think about these terms. You know, if you think about someone like G.A. Cohen, he wants to talk about evaluative standards as fact insensitive principles, or David Estlin talks about them as non-concessive principles. They don't concede the facts. And operational principles, I do like that term for reasons that might become clear a little bit later, but you might think of them as substantive principles or institutional principles. So anyway, let's just work with these ideas for the moment. And what I want to say is that that universal human rights can be either evaluative standards or operational principles. Perhaps that's not so surprising given the way I preface these remarks about how I think both this idea of the kind of Rousseauian Rawlsian idea and also the critique coming from the G.A. Cohens of the world, they both have something right to say. So maybe this isn't so remarkable that I think that they can be both. But I think the more philosophical, interesting part of this will be why I think they can be both. And so I want to say that they can be either these evaluative standards or operational principles, because the concept of human rights represents a common standard of achievement that modulates asymmetric power relations. And so this idea of a common standard of achievement, I think, is a very common idea, common way of talking about universal human rights. In fact, I just lifted it from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But there's less focus on how human rights work within contexts of power. I won't say there's no focus on that. There's lots of work on that. But when you hear people talk about rights, and when the practitioners of human rights are talking about rights, this idea of how they work with relations of power, I think, is not emphasized enough. And so one thing that I'm starting to think about more and work on more is this idea of human rights as modulating asymmetric power relations. And so the way I want to proceed with this talk is pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to go through these 4 different cases of human rights. Some are just kind of like examples. Others represent more philosophical arguments, and then just suggest some takeaways having gone through these different cases. And I hope this all serves as both philosophically interesting, but also these cases I hope are just really kind of engaging cases for us to think about. And I want to start with Abraham Lincoln, and I want to start with a speech that he gives, and it's often referred to as the Dred Scott speech, but it was during the younger Lincoln years, before he had any national recognition, and this is at the time where he's beginning to engage in what are have become known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They occurred in 1858, and those were historically important because they really were the first nationally reported debates in the country, but they were also on the issue of slavery, which was becoming a really divisive issue within the country. And this is when Lincoln is actually running for Senate. He doesn't yet have presidential aspirations, and he's running against this guy Stephen Douglas, who was the incumbent. He was the senator, and there's an interesting issue that comes up in this debate. So he's invited to speak in Springfield shortly after Stephen Douglas has spoken there, and Douglas had previously argued that the Declaration of Independence, when that was written, that it did not mean to include all people when they wrote that we know these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. In fact, Douglas argued that it only referred to white people, what we might call a particularist conception of human rights that are ascribed only to a particular group or member of a particular community, like all white British subjects. And Lincoln replied that, I'll quote, "I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men, but they did not intend to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. They defined with tolerable distinction in what respect they did consider all men created equal in certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This they said, and this they meant." Now, that's interesting, but what happens next in this speech, I think, is really interesting. Because what happens next is that Lincoln notes that Douglas accuses people like him, people like Lincoln, who think slavery is wrong, of wanting to, quote, "mix blood with black slaves by sleeping with them or marrying them." And Lincoln's response, this is really what I want to get to, that Lincoln responds by noting that it's under existing slavery laws that there are a much higher number of mulattoes than in free states. And he even goes in to give the exact numbers and drilling down into the statistics in places like Virginia versus New Hampshire. Now, I think this gets to a really sort of horrific aspect of slavery in the US that is not really talked about. You know, when kids learn about slavery in the US, they don't learn about the extent of sexual violence and rape that occurred, but it was, you know, well known at the time and a steadfast feature of slavery, and everyone knew it. And, you know, Frederick Douglass, who the former slave and abolitionist, he perhaps has the most, I think, incisive quote regarding this. So he did not know who his father was, but he suspected that his father was his master. And in his autobiography, he writes the following. He writes, that the slaveholders have ordained and by law established that the children of slave women shall in all cases follow the condition of their mothers, and this is done to obviously to administer to their own lust and make a gratification of their wicked desire profitable as well as pleasurable. For by this cunning arrangement, the slaveholder, in cases not few, sustains this, to his slaves the double relation of master and father. Now, I think that Lincoln's discussion of universal human rights in this context is powerful because it doesn't really require one to think long and hard about the moral wrongness of what happens to slave women under slavery laws in the US at that time. You know, we immediately judge rape to be wrong, and we could cite a number of principles, bodily integrity, equal moral worth, freedom from torture, to ground our judgment. And when we do this, I think we're relying on the kinds of evaluative standards that people like Cohen are thinking of, right? These basic principles that tell us what to think, even when thinking rightly about what we ought to do has no practical impact. And that's exactly how Lincoln describes the Declaration of Independence. He writes, and another quote which figures into the quote that you see on your slide, is that they did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even thought never perfectly attained, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. The assertion that all men are created equal was of no practical use in effecting our separation from Great Britain. And it was placed in the Declaration not for that, but for future use. Its authors meant it to be, thank God, it is now proving itself a stumbling block to those who after time might seek in turn a free people back into the hateful paths of despotism. So I think, you know, this is one case, one example, one instance where the idea of human rights as a evaluative standard is illustrated. So I want to move on to a very different case. Now I want to move on to the year 1946 and the early parts of the work concerning the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that work being started by the Commission on Human Rights, which was formed by the Economic and Social Council in 1946. By the way, just a little note, that first meeting of both those councils, as well as the very first meeting of the UN Security Council, happened in the Bronx, on my campus, 80 years ago today. And actually, we had in March the UN Security Council commemorating that event, and almost all the members of the UN Security Council were there to kind of tour the campus, and then also talk about the history there. So Eleanor Roosevelt is named chair of this Commission on Human Rights. She appoints somebody called Colonel Hodgson to start developing what they called as a Bill of Rights. And he starts doing this by just gathering different lists from existing constitutions. Now, what's interesting, and I don't fully know the history of this, is that in 1947, while the Commission on Human Rights is drafting what we come to know now as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UNESCO is establishing a philosophers committee to study the philosophical foundations of human rights. Now, this is historically kind of really interesting because earlier in that same year, the Commission on Human Rights had a little philosophical debate of its own about the foundations of human rights. And you had people like Charles Malik and P.C. Chang. They wanted to settle the philosophical debate about the source of human rights before moving on to a list. But another member from India, Hansa Mehta, she had none of that. She's like, no, we're not getting into that quote unquote maze of ideology. We're just going to get on with the business of writing a document. And that's what they did. They got on with the business of writing a document. Well, interestingly, UNESCO's philosophical committee, they submitted various surveys to people around the world who were prominent in their sort of area of normative philosophy or religion or theology, asking about this list of rights that was being developed. And the committee concludes that these very different ideologies could agree on the list of human rights, but on the condition that no one asks us why. This comes from Jacques Maritain in his 1949 recollections of those meetings. He goes on to note that UNESCO did not achieve, and he uses this term, which I think is really interesting, doctrinal consensus, but rather agreement concerning rights and concerning action of rights, excuse me, which may be justified on highly divergent grounds. So why do I find that language coming from 1949 so interesting? Well, philosophically, I think it's really interesting because it overlaps so nicely with what has come to be known in philosophy as the convergence view of public justification, where rather than we justify a set of principles and the same set of reasons, we justify them instead on different doctrinal views that each support different reasons that converge on or overlap with a set of, in this case, human rights principles. So on this view, it's the doctrinal view that's providing really the more basic evaluative standard that tells us which considerations count as good reasons in favor of a more substantive principle concerning rights and, importantly, concerning action and the realization and defense of rights. And that's important because that begins really to look a lot like the way I characterized an operational principle. Right? It's not just a list of these evaluative standards, but also, and this is really true in the case of the UDHR, a document establishing relevant entitlements and duty regarding rights. And this work, then I have here A and B on the slide, this kind of work gets fleshed out in a much more philosophically robust way by people like Charles Bates or Alan Buchanan, and their, what I'll just call a practice-based approach to human rights, thinking about the concept of human rights by investigating the practice. And so I'll just read a little something from Bates, who in his The Idea of Human Rights, he writes that this way of proceeding, this methodological practice-based way of proceeding, it prescinds, here's the quote, prescinds from taking any philosophical view about the nature or basis of human rights. The idea is to look at how the international human rights practice functions and draws from that an understanding of the idea of human rights. And, one way that both Bates and Buchanan think human rights function, particularly at the international level, where I originally got that quote about universal human rights, one way they agree upon is that human rights function so as to qualify legitimate sovereignty. Only states that respect, protect, and fulfill human rights qualify as legitimate in the international community. And this kind of formulation, which is the basically the formulation of the UDHR, but other covenants in international human rights law, it begins to look a lot more like a set of operational principles designed to operate in the context of international relations in a way that can define legitimate sovereignty and correct for some of the abuses that preceded the post World War II, human rights framework, which didn't qualify sovereignty, and by failing to qualify sovereignty, failed to really identify the moral considerations that can protect those who are vulnerable from state abuses. So this is suggestive, I think. It might not yet qualify as a really strong philosophical argument for why human rights principles can be operational principles, but I think the next one really does. And the next one concerns, now we're gonna go back, we're gonna move a bit forward in time to the 21st century, and hear what happens in the first decade of the 21st century is really interesting, because the UN really starts digging in to the idea of business and human rights. And what happens, I have to say, it's just, again, so interesting, because in that decade, you have two parallel frameworks moving forward. Almost at the same time, you have something called the norms framework that's moving forward, and something called the UN guiding principles of human rights that are moving forward. And one fails. One framework fails pretty badly, and the other succeeds. And I think the reason why one fails while the other succeeds is really telling for how to think about human rights. And the one that fails is the norms framework. And the norms framework, it wasn't able to garner any support. And I think that has to do with the fact that the norms framework proceeded by simply applying the international human rights law framework to businesses. So in effect, what it did was it ascribed to business, or businesses, multinational corporations, the obligations international human rights law ascribed to states. And by describing that, and here's just a quote from the norms framework, that transnational corporations and other business enterprises have obligations to promote, secure the fulfillment of, respect, ensure respect of, and protect human rights. So I have here on the right side of the slide, protect, respect, fulfill. That's standard sort of human rights language in international human rights law, where states have obligations to protect human rights violations. They have an obligation to protect their citizens from human rights obligations. They have an obligation to respect their citizens' rights, but they also have an obligation to fulfill human rights by, for example, working to ensure their citizens enjoy economic and social rights, working to ensure their citizens enjoy proper educations, adequate living standards, access to healthcare, and a number of economic and social rights. But why would you think that framework fits the business context and the multinational corporation context? And the question motivating the UN, and this is particularly important given the history at the time, what's happening, excuse me, because the question motivating the UN concerning corporations' obligations at the time were these adverse human rights impacts, given their role in what was an emerging global supply chain. And in this context, there were adverse effects of kind of externalizing harms where businesses were outsourcing activities to supply chains that were opaque. They dispersed power across different suppliers, subsidies, contractors, and in contexts where the protections for employees or the environment were very weak. So there were these governing gaps. So then the question became, well, what kinds of obligations do these multinational corporations have given this burgeoning global supply chain and the ways in which these kinds of adverse human rights impacts can find their way into it? Now, that's a very different kind of way of thinking about the application or the operation of human rights than following World War II, where really the questions were about the kinds of human rights violations states perpetrated against their own citizens, and how that had a knockoff effect for global peace, and how to think about a normative framework that can not only secure the protection of individuals against state atrocities, but do so in a way that supports global peace. So the norms framework really doesn't garner any support, but compare this to what happens with the UNGP, the Universal Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. They developed, and this was by a international relations scholar, John Ruggie. Some people might know that name. I really think he just is a carpentry exercise in how to think ethically within these complex contexts. He just does really an incredible job, and he's written a lot on how the UNGP developed, and it's really, I think, has helped me think more clearly about how to think about normative work in the political context. So he develops a very different framework. He develops what's really a kind of respect and remedy framework where corporations are obligated to respect human rights and to remedy adverse effects. And the protect function, he does have a protect function in that document, but the protect function is attributed to states, not businesses. It continues to be state obligations to protect individuals from human rights violations. And moreover, and this is really creative and important for business and human rights, that the universal guidelines, they develop a due diligence model that's designed to internalize the potential of adverse human rights violations. And that model has become really important for recent legislation in the UE, the corporate due diligence reporting model that has gone into effect last year. In California, they have a new due diligence reporting model for corporations. And in New York, they have legislation that's up for a vote soon, I believe, on a similar due diligence reporting on human rights and environmental practices. So the principles of this universal guiding principles on business and human rights, I think, are clearly operational principles, right? They reference all the human rights that are referenced in the international human rights law, but they develop principles about human rights and principles concerning action about respect for human rights and remedy of adverse harms. So both the norms and the UNGP reference the same set of international human rights law, but each attribute to business different human rights obligations. And I think it's because of that the norms framework really doesn't garner any support. It just doesn't fit its context of operation, whereas the UNGP framework specifies obligations that do fit its context. the context within which it's designed to operate. Okay, so now I'm going to go back in time to what's sometimes considered to be, and here I'll finish up soon, sometimes considered to be one of the, you know, early foundational events of contemporary human rights. There's a lot of debate about that. I'm not a historian. I don't know, but I do know, I always find this to be a compelling case in human rights because it really does seem to be an important moment when human rights emerge, at least within the Western tradition. So this case looks at the Spanish jurists, right, and Francisco de Victoria's work on the American Indians, and the key passage, it comes early on in the in his work, which is translated as gosh, now I'm forgetting, you know, on the American Indians or something like that. But where he asks whether indigenous peoples before the arrival of the Spaniards had true, quote, dominion, public and private. And it's this word dominion that I find so interesting, and how Vittoria in his writings, of which again, I'm not particularly scholarly about this period of history, but the way Vittoria develops this conception of dominion from Aquinas and from other medieval thinkers is really telling, because he uses this word to, you know, for him, the concept refers to, as it does, I think, for us, a kind of superiority over something, or an authority to rule over something, like God's dominion over all creation. And this idea of dominion implies a kind of capacity then to rule, or a capacity to order affairs of that which one has dominion over. But it also implies then a kind of rightful entitlement to something. And the question that Vittoria's asking is like the rightful entitlement to property or land. And so for Vittoria, the question then becomes who among humans has dominion? Who possesses the agency to rule over something? And he's concerned with, do sinners, do infidels, do children, do natural slaves? And then whoever possesses this capacity, this dominion to rule over something, has rightful entitlement to do so. So I think today we think of this in terms of negative rights, right? A freedom from interference of coercion because I'm rightfully entitled to act, to exercise agency over this particular field. So the question about whether indigenous people have dominion is one about whether or not they have rights. And Vittoria's answer to this, drawing on a long tradition of thought and doing these conceptual philosophical things with these terms that come from medieval philosophy to tie them together with a kind of rights language I think we could recognize today, right? He answers this question about whether or not the indigenous people have dominion by saying that they do. And he quotes that the proof of this is that they are in fact, they are not irrational. And this gets to, I think, what's in the slide here. But we have, they have judgment like other men. This is clear because they have a certain order in their affairs, ordered cities, separate marriages, magistrates, rulers, laws, industries, and commerce, all of which require the use of reason. The conclusion of all of what has been said is that they could not be robbed of their property, either as private citizens, private property, or as princes, sovereignty. So we get to all these political ideas. They have rights that they cannot be robbed of. Now, what makes, I think, Vittoria and the Spanish jurists so interesting is not just the way that they're taking medieval ideas and starting to develop them into concepts that we could recognize around rights, but all this happens against the backdrop of incredible colonial oppression over the native peoples in Mexico and Peru, right? Vittoria was a Dominican friar. He's getting reports from other members of the Dominican order who are witnessing events as they unfold. And one of those is Las Casas, who's providing detailed reports of gratuitous torture, enslavement, the breaking up of families, the total collapse of the birth rate, starvation, all due to the practices that Spaniards are inflicting upon, the harms they're inflicting upon the native population. In Las Casas, too, he writes about this in terms of rights. He's less philosophical, but he's also more passionate than Vittoria. And like Vittoria, he's framing much of this debate about Native peoples in terms of what we what today we might call negative rights, the freedom from a kind of oppression and cruelty. So together, both the theoretical progression from this concept of dominion to human rights, and that progression happening against the backdrop of raw cruelty and oppression, I think, again, is instructive about how to think about this concept of human rights. And what arguably the emergence of human rights, at least in the Western world, is a deep reflection on morality in these contexts of power. Okay, so what are my takeaways? So theoretical takeaways from these different cases, and this idea of framing the concept or thinking about the concept of human rights as moral standards of aspiration that modulate asymmetric powers, is that theoretically it demystifies the idea of individual human rights by situating it within power relations. So when even I, who do work in human rights, when I think about human rights and teach it and talk with others who are in the practice, these are individual human rights that attach to persons. And that idea, that relational idea that I think is really important and helpful, it gets lost. I wouldn't say it disappears. I think it's in the background of everyone's head, but it really gets lost. And this is a way of kind of recentering that. And then that focus, that relational element, I think it helps sort of balance the relationship between entitlements and obligations. There is a very natural, logical relationship and entailment between rights and obligations, but the logical relationship, I think, is often poorly characterized because of the part of the intellectual history of human rights as emphasizing these individual attributes that people have, and so I'm growing more interested in thinking about the context of asymmetric power relations. But on the practical side, I think this is also helpful because it's a more robust way of framing the expansion of human rights discourse. We could think about why human rights discourse might apply in contexts that we haven't applied them to before, because of the way in which those new developments create new relations of power, that and how those new relations of power pose really risks to certain individuals who are losing their own agency within those relations. But at the same time, I think it can help expose the limits of the human rights discourse. I think what happens, particularly in the practice, is that once people start using the human rights framework, it is easy to just use it, to overuse it, and it's easy to forget about other moral discourse that might actually work better for whatever the issue is that you might be talking about. So I think there's that, and this gets back to something I said at the beginning. There's a practical worry and disillusionment within some people in the practice that human rights have been hijacked for purposes for which it was never originally designed. Now, whether or not that's true or not, there's this sense of the overuse of human rights and its expansion beyond what it's capable of doing, and bring back in those power relations might be a way to think about the limits of human rights discourse. Okay, so I think I will end it there, and I think I'm well within time, maybe not, I don't know, depending on how late we started.
I'll pass the microphone around if there are any questions. Wait. She will not hear you.
Yeah.
My English is not very good, but I will try. What's the limit to human rights for you?
What are the limits of human rights? Was that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, good question. So what are the limits of human rights? You know, I don't have so the way that I think about political philosophies, I do think of it as a kind of form of normative analysis. I don't think of it as a way of specifying a set of rules that are true for all eternity. Now, there might be some basic principles. These are the ones, you know, these evaluative standards that do help us think about which considerations count as good reasons in favor of certain kinds of actions. But whether or not they actually do that kind of work in a particular context is going to depend on other facts going on. So what are the limits of human rights discourse? Well, you know, it could be the case that when we think about issues of, let's say, you know, development and economic development, or we think about issues of educational access or healthcare access, that maybe human rights is not the best way to formulate it. Maybe when thinking about, you know, quality and accessible education or quality and accessible healthcare, the idea of just thinking about it in terms of certain entitlement claims, maybe that's limiting in certain ways. So you know, I think the idea is that, you know, we want to think about, when thinking about how human rights do in fact apply or do in fact work, we have to think about the way in which those asymmetric power relations are either being you know, widened or narrowed. So so in some of the work now that I'm thinking about in terms of, you know, business and human rights, I mean, the way in which businesses are not just growing in terms of economic power, but also the way in which they have a kind of freedom to move around jurisdictions gives them a really extraordinary kind of power for which human rights discourse might really be powerful and appropriate. I know in people who are more conservatives, with like a small c, a lot of people in the human rights and peace practice have come from a religious background, and they're really unhappy with the way that human rights are applied in family contexts. And now I don't know if any of those arguments are really legitimate. I'd have to think more about that. But it could be the case that other moral discourses are more effective in those contexts. So, it gets to, like, I suppose the idea of again, how do human rights create a common standard of aspiration? And whether or not this greater focus on asymmetric power relations helps find the commonality in which human rights can do that aspirational work.
Thank you, Michael. Maybe my question is related. I'm remember a distinction that I saw firstly in reading Joel Feinberg's text. For example, in social philosophy, Joel Feinberg talk that human rights are in a version of human rights talk. Human rights are rights in a manifesto sense, but there are another interpretation that human rights are rights in a proper sense of right. And so there is a discussion between if human rights are, or human rights talk, are rights only in an aspirational sense, that is the manifesto sense, or if they are rights in a proper sense, in the same semantic as used in legal discourse. So this is my interpretation. So my question for you is, what is operational in this case? Because it seems that your two versions or two meaning of rights, the kind of the operational seems to me proximate or similar to the rights in appropriate sense, in a proper sense, that is similar to, for example, the legal discourse. That is, if I have a right, for example, a claim right, if I have a right, another person has an obligation towards me. And this is the semantic discourse of the legal discourse. See, for example, the Wesley Newcomb-Hoffel semantic. What is your meaning for, in this case, for the operational sense of rights?
Okay, thank you. So yeah, when I use that term operational, and maybe it's not the best term. If I used substantive rights, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if any of the confusion would go away. But it's the idea that the rights, the formulation of rights draws on considerations particular to their context of operation, such that their justification depends on those considerations. This makes it, in a way, what let's say Cohen would call fact dependent, because those considerations are going to cite facts about the context. Now, because they are substantive, I think you're right in that they can be more easily articulated as law. But in those two examples I gave that I thought supported the idea of operational principles, neither are law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not law. It's just a declaration. The UN's guiding principles on business and human rights is not law. They're just guiding principles. Now, it's true that following the UDHR, there were a number of other covenants that became international law. And it's also true that now parts of the world, Europe, California, New York, are drawing on the universal guiding principles to formulate regulatory law. So I think that that the idea is right that these operational principles are more easily able to be codified into law. But I think my real interest is really in how the formulation and justification of these principles develops, and whether or not the formulation and justification depends upon the facts within which those principles are to operate, or are they in some sense independent of those facts. So the case with Lincoln and Victoria was to illustrate, I think, how the plausibility of the idea of human rights is just these basic evaluative principles that are true independent of the factual considerations that we might apply them to. I hope that answered the question.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It was so interesting. I think I share like inspired by Marcos. I have like a question as well about that first slide and that distinction between the evaluative and the operational, the evaluative standards and the operational principles. And I guess I'm interested in what those categories, what work they're doing for you. And in particular, I was struck by the idea that if we have an evaluative standard stance, then they tell us what is right or wrong, but I guess implicitly they're not action guiding, because it seemed to be the case from the way you framed the operational principles, that you wrote like is what tells us what to do. But I was thinking like, like if you're a moral realist or something, you think both that like there are objective moral principles and that they're action guiding, and you don't hold them to be context dependent. And so I was wondering if there are like other ways of framing this, that, like I kind of wonder who occupies the position that a standard can tell you what is right and wrong, but not be action guiding in some way if you hold it to be, universally true and morally true at that. So yeah, so I was interested in that distinction, and maybe you could tell me a little bit more about it.
Okay, so if I understand, and there's a little echo, so I'm having a little trouble. But so the question is mostly focused on this idea of like evaluative standards. They tell us what to think, but not necessarily what to do. And like why would that be the case? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So so that actually does come from G.A. Cohen. Cohen says this about fact insensitive principles. Now, it's not, he doesn't say that they just tell us what to do, and they just tell us what to think and they never tell us what to do, but rather that they tell us what to think even when knowing what to think doesn't tell us what to do. So I don't think like it's terribly important to like the bigger argument whether or not, to what extent they don't tell us what to do, because you might say that when Lincoln is talking about all men created equal, as applying to everyone, it does tell us what to do about slavery, right? Why wouldn't it tell us what to do about slavery? And so there might be a way in which you know, the claim is that no, an evaluative standard does tell me what to do, but it might also be the case that that it doesn't tell me what to do. So, for example, like you know, let's say you have a vague idea about data rights in the age of AI, that you know the asymmetric power relations between big tech companies and me as a user of technology is undermining my agency in a way that violates you know, my right. Maybe it's undermining my agency in a way that violates my ability to make a living. And so you might have an intuition about something really morally wrong going on here with the way AI is developing, but you might not yet know what to do about it. And you know, so I do think there are ways in which when we encounter new you know, new situations, or we encounter crises that you know, look at the thing about like COVID, for example, and what to do when you have a novel virus that's spreading across the world. How do you you know, what protections are morally justifiable and what are not, or are suspensions of rights in those cases morally justifiable, or are they not? So I think there can be times in which we have certain evaluative intuitions about something being wrong without necessarily knowing how to proceed. And I found the, you know, the Lincoln text interesting, partly because he says that specific claim that they knew, they being the writers of the Declaration of Independence, they knew that that everyone had rights, even though that wasn't going to make any action effective. You know, just one more thing I'd add to that is that when Eleanor Roosevelt was talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, she didn't talk about principles of human rights. She talked about principles about human rights. And I find that interesting. Now, I'm not exactly sure where to go with this, but if you read these documents, whether or not they're international conventions on human rights, or whether or not they're frameworks of business and human rights, they contain a lot of language about human rights that frame the way in which I think the moral commitments represented by the idea of rights are to operate. Right? So it is the case, and this is true of even the United States Bill of Rights, with the exception of the 13th Amendment, that rights are almost always entitlements people have vis-a-vis their state. They're almost never, and certainly never in international documents, entitlements people have vis-a-vis each other. So they're always, you know, in international law, they're always operating as obligations on states towards their citizens, and entitlements citizens have as expectations from their states. And of course, states is you know, it's a social construct. So there's this kind of, I think, a really interesting way in which international human rights law develops, that can sometimes be, you know, be different from the way we ordinarily think of, let's say, human rights, when we just think of it as you know, in a non-philosophical or non-legalistic way.
Yes. I don't know, it's 35. Okay, so thank you so much, Michael.
So thanks, Michael, for
Thank you,
for your
everyone.
amazing-
I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the questions, the really great questions, and you know, I hope one day I get to talk to everyone again, you know, about these issues.
We'll be waiting for that. Thank you. We
Thank you, and
appreciate-
enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks. Appreciate. I just have to say thank you, and I enjoy to closing our conference right now. We have more time for dinner and a inside around Rio, but I really like to appreciate your time you spend being here in person or virtually for this first symposium of Face of Vulnerability. As you already know, or some of you know, I think we got this going for the third phase of this project. We got money for next time, in probably in 2028, we're gonna have the second symposium. So I hope Mike will be in person, the other colleagues, Anneli and Lisa will be in person, and we can incorporate more members for increase our gang. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Michael. And our conference end up, but we still have some time to talk about, and you hear from me by email at least. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye.